I was 7 months pregnant when my mother-in-law stood up at her own dinner table, looked me dead in the eye, and told 12 people that the baby inside me wasn't her son's. My husband didn't defend me. He didn't even look up. He stared at his plate like it held the answer to a problem he'd already solved weeks ago, because he had. He'd known for 19 days. He let her humiliate me anyway. And then, right as the room went silent and every fork stopped moving, my phone rang. A hospital number. I almost didn't answer it. That call didn't just interrupt the worst moment of my life, it ended up unraveling all of it. My name is Vivian Redmond, and this is the story of the year my family tried to erase me, and the one phone call that made sure they couldn't. I need to back up, because none of this made sense until you understood who Eleanor Redmond was before she ever became my mother-in-law. I met Tobias 3 years ago at a fundraiser in Savannah, back when I was still doing freelance interior design downtown. He was warm in a way that felt earned, not performed, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order after one conversation. His family ran Redmond Builders, a construction company his grandfather started, and by the time I met Tobias, it was worth enough that people in his circle started sentences with, "when you inherit." Eleanor never liked me. Not in a loud way, she was too careful for that. It was quieter. She'd compliment my dress and then ask if I'd considered something more classic for the next event. She'd introduce me to her friends as Tobias's girlfriend long after we were engaged, like the word wife hadn't earned its way into her mouth yet. I told myself it was a phase. Mothers get protective. She'd come around once we were married. She'd come around once there were grandchildren. She did not come around. If anything, the pregnancy made it worse. The day I told her, she smiled with her mouth and said, "Well, that's certainly fast," like I'd done something calculated instead of something that happens to married people. I let it go. I let a lot of things go that year, because I was tired, and because Tobias kept telling me she just needed time. Here's what I didn't know. Eleanor had been telling her friends for weeks that something was off about the timeline of my pregnancy. She never said it to my face. She said it to her book club, to her hairdresser, to anyone who'd nod along. And at some point in early spring, she brought that same story to Tobias, dressed up as concern, the way mothers do when they want to plant something without owning it. "I just think you should ask her some questions, honey. For your own peace of mind." Twice, he told me much later, he almost came to me directly. But each time, his mother asked him to wait, just a little longer, until she had real proof, something undeniable she claimed was on its way. So he waited. For 19 days, my husband carried a doubt about our child that he never once brought to the one person who could have answered it in 5 minutes. Me. I found all of this out later, piece by piece, the way you find out a house has termites, not from one obvious sign, but from a dozen small cracks that finally add up to something you can't ignore. But that night at dinner, I didn't know any of it yet. I only knew that Eleanor had invited us to what she called a family celebration to kick off my baby shower season. 12 people, her dining room, her good china. I remember feeling grateful. I remember thinking, maybe this is it. Maybe this is her coming around. We were on the second course when she tapped her wine glass, and the table went quiet the way rooms do when someone's about to give a toast. I remember smiling, one hand resting on my belly, genuinely expecting a kind word. Instead, Eleanor set her glass down, looked directly at me, and said, "I think it's time we stopped pretending. This baby isn't Tobias's. I have a report from someone in the medical field, and I think this family deserves the truth before we celebrate anything." For a second, I actually laughed. I thought it was a joke gone wrong, some strange attempt at humor that had landed sideways. Then I looked around the table and understood that no one else was laughing either. 12 faces, and every single one of them was either staring at their plate or staring at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I turned to Tobias. This was the moment. This was the moment a husband is supposed to stand up and say, "That's insane, Mom. Apologize to my wife right now." Instead, He looked down at his plate and pushed a piece of chicken across it like it required his full concentration. He said nothing. Not a word in my defense. Not even a glance in my direction. I felt my face go hot, then cold. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I stood up, too fast, my chair scraping loud against the hardwood, and said the only thing I could manage, "That's not true, and you know it's not true." My voice cracked on the last word. Eleanor just folded her hands and said, "I understand this is hard to hear," in the calm, practiced tone of someone who had rehearsed this moment in a mirror. That's when my phone rang. I almost silenced it. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the thing into the mashed potatoes. But it was a local hospital number, and something in my gut told me to answer it, even with 11 pairs of eyes on me and my mother-in-law's accusation still hanging in the air like smoke. It was about my father. Walter Doyle, 61 years old, had collapsed at his own kitchen table 2 hours earlier. A neighbor found him. He was in the emergency room, stable but under observation, and they needed someone to come sign off on his care since my mother passed years ago and I was his only listed contact. I didn't even look at Tobias. I grabbed my purse and walked out of that house so fast I forgot my cardigan on the back of the chair. It was Tobias's sister, Camille, who caught up with me in the driveway, car keys already in hand, saying, "I'm driving you. Don't argue with me." Tobias did not follow us out. Not that night. He stayed inside, at his mother's table, and let his wife drive to a hospital alone with his sister while carrying his child. I want you to sit with that for a second because I did, the entire ride there. 19 minutes of silence in Camille's car, watching the streetlights blur past, thinking about how a man can watch his mother destroy his wife in front of a room full of people and decide the correct response is to keep eating his dinner. My father was stable when we arrived, a minor cardiac event, the kind that scares you far more than it actually harms you, though we didn't know that yet. I sat next to his hospital bed for almost 2 hours before a doctor came in to check on both of us, since I was visibly pregnant and clearly not doing well myself. My blood pressure was elevated from the stress of the night, and they wanted to keep an eye on me before letting me leave. That's when Camille said something that changed the entire direction of that night. She waited until the doctor stepped out, then took my hand and said, "Vivian, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not react in a way that gets us kicked out of this hospital." She told me that 2 nights earlier, she'd overheard her mother on the phone with someone named Dr. Renner, not a Redmond family physician, not anyone Camille recognized, but a name she'd since looked into. Dr. Renner had lost his license 8 years ago for falsifying results in a paternity dispute case, and had spent the years since doing consulting work for people willing to pay for a very specific kind of document. Camille believed her mother had paid him to forge a laboratory letterhead and put together a fabricated interpretation designed to look like a legitimate report, using a hairbrush she'd borrowed from our house the last time she watched our dog. I felt sick in a way that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. I asked my OB, who happened to be on call that night, to personally look over my prenatal file before I left. She found nothing unusual, no outside report on record, no request for any paternity screening, nothing that matched what Eleanor had described at that table. Whatever Eleanor was holding, it hadn't come from any legitimate channel connected to my actual care. I sat in that hospital room with that small, quiet piece of information, and the only thing running through my mind was, why? Why go this far? Why pay a disbarred doctor and steal a hairbrush and destroy your own son's marriage in front of 12 dinner guests, when the truth was 1 phone call away the entire time? Camille answered that question for me too, later that week, over coffee in a booth far from anyone who knew our names. She told me what she'd pieced together from years of watching her mother operate. Eleanor had never wanted Tobias to marry me. She'd had someone else in mind for years, a family friend named Paige Holloway, whose father owned a development firm that Eleanor had been trying to fold into Redmond Builders for the better part of a decade. A marriage between Tobias and Paige wasn't just personal preference to Eleanor. It was a business merger she'd been quietly engineering since before I ever walked into that family's life. There was more. My father-in-law's original trust, the one that controlled the bulk of Redmond Builders' shares, named Eleanor as trustee with wide discretion over how succession played out. Camille believed her mother saw a real opportunity in the timing. If my marriage ended before the baby arrived, Eleanor would have far more control over shaping what came next, with fewer complications standing between her and the merger she'd wanted for years. She wasn't protecting her son from betrayal. She was protecting a business plan from an inconvenient daughter-in-law. And Tobias had a card of his own in this, one he hadn't shown me. Years before we met, he and Paige had a brief relationship that ended badly, and Eleanor knew exactly which buttons to press. When she came to him with her manufactured concerns, she didn't just plant doubt about the baby. She reminded him, gently, repeatedly, that maybe this was the universe correcting a mistake he'd made when he chose me over the woman his family had always pictured beside him. He didn't believe the paternity lie, not really, not deep down. But he let it sit there anyway, because some small, ugly part of him wondered if it gave him a door he hadn't let himself admit he wanted. 19 days of silence, and that was the real reason behind it. I didn't go back to that house. Not that week, not the week after. I stayed with my father while he recovered, and Camille stayed close by, bringing me groceries and sitting with me on evenings when the weight of everything got too heavy to carry alone. Tobias called constantly. I let most of it go to voicemail. When I finally did answer, his first words weren't an apology. They were an explanation, a long, winding account of how confused he'd been, how his mother had seemed so certain, how he didn't know what to believe. I let him talk until he ran out of words, and then I said the only thing that felt true. You didn't need to know what to believe. You needed to ask me. I called a lawyer the following week. His name was Harold Ingram, a calm, unhurried man who'd handled 2 decades of Savannah's messiest family business disputes, and I laid the entire thing out for him. The fabricated report, the disbarred doctor, the hairbrush, the trust arrangement, all of it. Harold didn't blink. He'd seen versions of this before. Families with money, he told me, don't usually fight with fists. They fight with paperwork, timing, and quiet manipulation, and the damage is just as real even though it never leaves a mark you can point to. Harold's investigator started with the letterhead Eleanor had waved around that night, tracking it back to the laboratory it claimed to represent. The compliance office there confirmed in writing that no such report had ever been generated under their name. The letterhead was forged, and the signature on it belonged to a lab employee who'd retired 6 years earlier and hadn't worked a single case since. Layered on top of that was a wire transfer, $4,000, sent from Eleanor to Dr. Renner 2 weeks before the dinner, disguised as a home inspection fee. It wasn't hard to trace once someone actually looked. It came together fast after that. 3 weeks after the dinner, we held a meeting in Harold's office. Eleanor, Tobias, Camille, Harold, and me. I laid the compliance letter on the table first, followed by the wire transfer records. I watched Eleanor's face while she read them, and for the first time since I'd known her, I watched her composure actually crack. She reached for an excuse, something about looking out for her son's future, but there's no version of forging a laboratory letterhead and paying a disbarred doctor that sounds like protection once you say it out loud in front of witnesses. The other trustees on the Redmond Builders Board didn't take it lightly either. Fabricating documents to manipulate a family trust isn't just a personal betrayal, it's the kind of thing that gets a trustee formally removed, which is exactly what happened within the month. Eleanor lost her seat on the board she'd spent decades protecting, stripped of the very influence she tried to use against me. As for Tobias, I didn't leave him out of anger, not exactly. I left because I finally understood something I hadn't let myself see before. Silence is its own kind of answer. He didn't need to say the words out loud for me to know where I stood. 19 days of watching him choose comfort over defending me told me everything his mouth never did. Harold helped me negotiate a fair, quiet settlement, and 6 weeks after my son was born, I signed the last of the papers that ended that marriage for good. I named my son after my father. Walter Doyle Redmond came into the world on a Tuesday morning, loud and furious and perfect, and when the nurse placed him on my chest, I thought about that dinner table, about the phone ringing at the worst possible moment, about how something that felt like the world falling apart turned out to be the exact thread that unraveled a lie built to bury me. Camille still comes by every Sunday. She says she got the better end of that family in the divorce, and I don't argue with her. My father walks Walter around the block most evenings, slower than he used to, but steady. And every so often, I think about the version of that night where I never answer the phone, where I go home and let the silence win, and I'm grateful every single time that I didn't. Here's what I carry with me now. The truth doesn't need you to raise your voice. It just needs you to keep the receipts, and wait for the moment it can't be denied. If someone you trusted stayed silent while you needed them the most, would you have stayed, or would you have walked out that door too? If this story hit you the way it hit me to live it, hit subscribe to Sophie Revenge. New stories drop every single day.